All right, I am live and I'm here with my good boys Watson and Morty. There's Watson, there's Morty, really hanging out real close. There's Watson, and then there's one of my cats in the background. I'm on the couch today because I'm tired and I kind of want to chill and pretend like this is more of a laid-back setting. So y'all are getting me on the couch. I got my comfy pants on. I got my comfy blanket. I got my comfy t-shirt. I got my pups. Good to go. We're going to hit the rest of period 3 as much as I can get through. I'm hoping to get through all of period 3. And then, again, just a reminder, in about an hour and a half, you guys can start, assuming you're watching this live, in about an hour and a half, you guys can join into that Kahoot game, which will be pretty cool. I'm going to try and play as well. All right, so period 3, again, period 3, 600 CE to 1450 CE. I talked a little bit about the trade that happens in period 3. A lot of it is just going to continue over or be the same concepts about trade from period 2, trade in the classical era. So you're going to have empires, these large land empires facilitating trade. You're going to have nomadic peoples facilitating trade because they already are moving back and forth anyway. So, trade is just going to be super easy for them. You're going to have trade in luxury goods happening this whole time, but as we get better technology, as we get technology that allows us to leave our money at home, use things like credit, paper money, checking systems, technology that makes it easier to travel with large sums of money or without large sums of money, in trade in luxury goods is going to increase. And again, when we're talking luxury goods, we're talking salt, gold, precious gems, horses, spices, silks, and porcelain from China, and of course also slaves, because we are going to be considering human beings commodities at this point. The other thing that you need to know about period 3 for trade, just to recap, is that sometimes, we're going to have explicit state practices facilitating trade. And what I mean by that is, like, having empires around will always facilitate trade in general. The fewer government borders you have to cross through, the stronger these, the more protected these roads are. All of those things are going to just naturally facilitate trade. But when you have states and governments and empires intentionally doing things to try and facilitate trade, that will also help. So a great example from this time are the Inca building their road systems. If you guys remember, the Inca Empire in South America is going to develop during this time, and their road systems are going to help encourage trade across the empire. You're also going to have so actually, before I move on from the Inca, just if you guys remember also, the Inca are one of the few, maybe the only major civilization that doesn't actually have merchants that work independently. They have people hired by the government to go back and forth and move goods along the road system they built in the Andes Mountains, but they don't actually have a class of merchants. So if you had a compare and contrast essay or had some kind of essay where you're going to talk about like society in the Inca Empire, that might be an interesting thing to remember. They didn't actually have a separate group of people that chose to dedicate their life to trade. Another example would be the Hanseatic League, which is this Northern European organization of traders, of merchants, who kind of banded together, pooled their resources so that they could more easily protect their ships, that they could regulate trade a little bit better. Then you're also going to have things like the Grand Canal, which was built in the Sui dynasty, and that's that north and south running canal, that north and south running waterway that links the Yellow River to the Yangtze River, and it makes trading possible across China by water going north, south, east, or west, which is going to make trade a lot easier. One of those universal truths in world history is that anytime you can trade on water or travel on water, It's going to be a lot easier. It's going to be a lot faster, a lot safer, a lot cheaper. And so people are going to try and travel by water, move goods by water as much as they can. Speaking of water, let's talk about some of these groups of people that are going to be moving around in period 3. The first example, which is my segue about water, are the Polynesian peoples, the peoples of the Pacific Islands. So again, think Moana, think those wayfinders who measured the stars, who mapped the stars and used their knowledge of wind currents and the constellations in the sky and which species of sea life lived in deep ocean versus shallow ocean. And they used their knowledge of the environment, that interaction with the environment, to travel extremely long distances in their outrigger canoes across the Pacific Ocean. And they island hopped and they started to settle all of these teeny tiny islands that just kind of cover the Pacific Ocean. They brought their domesticated plants and animals with them, things like the sweet potato, things like the chicken, the pig. And we know that they brought these groups of plants and animals with them, these domesticated plants and animals with them, because the words for these plants and animals are very similar across all of the dialects of the Polynesian languages. The word for sweet potato, I don't have it off the top of my head, but the word for like sweet potato, chicken, they are going to be familiar across the dialects, which suggests that these people were moving these plants and animals intentionally. It wasn't just like you had like chicken eggs or like sweet potatoes washing up on shore and people discovered them and then like all coincidentally made use of them. The language shows us that there was a cultural connection with the movement of these plants and animals. Another great example of people movements that had a big environmental impact would be the Bantu people, who migrated across sub-Saharan Africa, and they brought with them their knowledge of ironworking and farming. They were some of the first people in sub-Saharan Africa to develop agriculture and farming, to have that Neolithic revolution that kind of spontaneously occurs around the world. And so as they expand across sub-Saharan Africa, everyone they encounter is kind of going to be dominated by them and their ability to use iron weapons, iron tools. The farming that they establish will make them have a much larger population than some of these other groups of people they encounter. So basically everyone in sub-Saharan Africa that the Bantu people encounter are either going to be destroyed by the Bantu people as they migrate across sub-Saharan Africa, or they're just going to be absorbed into this Bantu culture, which is also part of the reason why basically every native African dialect in sub-Saharan Africa is also going to be very familiar and have a lot of similarities with the other dialects, because the Bantu language will become the dominant language in sub-Saharan Africa. Eventually, the Bantu people will reach the Swahili coast, the eastern coast of Africa on the Indian Ocean, and there they will blend their culture with the Arab traders who are engaging in this Indian Ocean trade. And that culture that develops out of the Bantu and the Arab is going to be called Swahili, which is why the city-states that develop on the eastern coast of Africa, places like Kilwa, Zanzibar, they're going to be known as the Swahili city-states. Again, another great example of that rare political form in world history, the city-state. The Greeks, the Maya, the Swahili are going to be probably the 3 best examples of city-states. Oh, and the Italians in like pre-unification Italy. So the Bantu people are going to spread their language across sub-Saharan Africa. At the same time, you know, remember, language is spreading across the Middle East by the Arabs and the Turks. So as Islam expands out of Saudi Arabia after like 633 CE, Arabic as a language is going to spread all over Afro-Eurasia, not just because of these Arab conquerors going out and expanding the caliphate, not just because of trade, but also, thirdly, because the religion of Islam must be practiced in the Arabic language. If you practice Islam, you must be able to read the Quran in Arabic. Most of the services on the holy days, the Saturday, or I'm sorry, like Friday evening, Saturday for Muslims, most of those services are conducted in Arabic. So even if you live in the United States today, I'm sorry that the light keeps cutting out. I don't know why that's doing that. Even if you live in the United States today, if you are a practicing devout Muslim, you are expected to at least have a passable understanding of Arabic for the practice of your faith. So as people choose to convert to Islam, they'll pick up this religion as part of their religious belief practice. Similarly, Turkish language is going to spread across this region, especially as the Ottomans become a force in the region, or I'm sorry, in this time period, and they start to expand. So languages are just going to really start to spread across the known world as more and more people become interconnected. Just being able to share a common language with people for trade, for religion, it's very, very helpful. All right, let's see. So as people begin to interact with each other more and more frequently, you're going to have some long distance travelers, some people who go above and beyond. Hey, my husband's home. Some people who go above and beyond just that basic little back and forth that most merchants will engage in. If you guys remember, people like Marco Polo, who was an Italian merchant who allegedly traveled to the court of Kublai Khan in China. People like Ibn Battuta, who was a Muslim scholar who traveled all over the Muslim world and wrote about his travels. Those are some really great examples of these travelers who make use of these increasingly safe trade routes, this increasingly fast modes of transportation, this increasingly connected world, and they really sort of revolutionize world travel in a way that, you know, is very, very new for world history. All right, so we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but another major consequence of people interacting more and more and people traveling further is going to be not just trade goods spreading and diseases spreading, but cultures spreading and technology spreading and religion spreading. So some examples, I mean, Christianity will really expand across Europe during this time. I talked about that a little bit in the last video. You're also going to have Eastern Orthodox Christianity going from the Byzantine Empire to the Kievan Rus, which will become Russia. So that's why the Russians and the Greeks both practice Orthodox Christianity. You're going to have Neo-Confucianism spreading from China to Japan and Korea. You're also going to have Buddhism spreading into Japan and Korea. Hinduism and Buddhism are both going to spread into Southeast Asia in this time as trade expands in the Indian Ocean trade routes and the Southeast Asian trade routes. Of course, Islam will be spreading across Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, into Asia. And the Aztecs and the Inca, as those empires expand, remember, they're here too. And they're going to, you know, exert their cultural influence over their regions as well. So, of course, we're also going to have food, crops, diseases, and things spreading from region to region. The best example of the disease will be the Black Death. That's that specific outbreak of bubonic plague that happens in the 1340s. Probably starts in China, spreads westward, and by the late 1340s, basically every part of Afro-Eurasia north of the Sahara Desert will have been devastated by this disease. It is very extremely deadly. Some places are going to see upwards of 50% fatality rates. Some villages are going to be entirely wiped out. The statistics vary from culture to culture, but it's a devastating disease. The Black Death, remember though, is just one in a line of series of bubonic plague outbreaks. It's not the only time we see the bubonic plague. We saw it a lot in period 2. Rome and China got hit by a couple of bubonic plague outbreaks that probably helped bring them down. We're going to see them come up later, but it's just probably the worst. Of course, you're going to also have other things spreading during this time, like food. So again, this is when bananas are going to spread across sub-Saharan Africa. Cotton, sugar, citrus are all going to really spread across the Indian Ocean and the Middle East. And then you've got that champa rice coming over from Vietnam. All right, so that was a little recap, maybe too long of a recap in Key Concept 3.1, but now we're going to move on to Key Concept 3.2. We're going to talk about those different political organizations that we are going to have in period 3. So context for period 3. Period 3, 600 to 1450, comes at the heels of the collapse of those major classical empires. So the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the collapse of the Han Dynasty, the collapse of the Gupta Empire in India, the collapse of the Persian empires. And we're going to be dealing with what people do and how people respond to all of this political chaos. So period 3 is really going to be about new forms of government, new forms of society. How are people going to cope with the loss of all of this power? Some of these empires have been around for centuries, and now they're gone. So how are people going to be coping with that? So in Western Europe, you are going to see total anarchy. I talked to some kids about this today, but think like The Walking Dead. All of the institutions that the Roman Empire developed are basically going to be gone. It's anarchy, it's chaos, it's every man for themselves. And over time, over hundreds of years, what will happen is you will have warlords and strongmen slowly bring more and more people under their control until we have these little feudal states, Feudal, the feudalism system that will have developed in Western Europe and Japan at this time, where excuse me, the nobles or the warlords will hire knights or trained soldiers to protect the peasants, and in turn the peasants will work the land and give a portion of their work back to the nobles. And so it's a way for the nobles to protect the poor people who probably couldn't defend themselves. And not only is that going to kind of develop as a result of the Western Roman Empire collapsing, and again, just to remind you, when we talk Western Roman Empire, we're talking places that are now modern-day Germany, France, Spain, Portugal, England, that part of Europe, that western half of Europe. But it's also going to be as a result of the Viking raids. So we actually in Western Europe almost got a different type of government. We kind of emerged out of this feudal system, and it looked like we were going to be organized in an empire again, that Holy Roman Empire under Charlemagne. But when the Viking raids really picked up, and that Viking era is going to start after the first raid on Lindisfarne, which will happen, let's see if I can just get that date for you really fast, 793. So 793 CE, about 300 years after the Western Roman Empire collapses, the Vikings are going to go on the hunt. They're going to start raiding. The problem with having one big empire in Western Europe at this time is that the Vikings are fast, they're quiet, and they're very deadly. So one emperor all the way over in what's now modern-day Germany will not be able to protect people in England or France or Ireland or anywhere else, because by the time he learns that the Vikings are coming, the Vikings could have come and gone 6 times with their loot, with their plunder. Those Viking longships that can sail in deep ocean, but that can also sail in very shallow rivers, make them a force to be reckoned with. And so people are going to move back away from this Holy Roman Empire towards a localized system of rule where you have strong rulers everywhere, strong knights everywhere, and you always know that you'll probably be protected. So that's what happens in Western Europe. This is the same time that the Eastern Roman Empire is doing just fine. Excuse me. They're thriving, they're doing well, they're doing their own thing. You should definitely know the cultural differences between the Byzantine Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. But I'm probably not going to go into that right now. Just make a note. If you couldn't tell me that right now, make a note of that. Go and do some digging. Excuse me. In the West, in the Western Roman Empire especially, there are some traditional sources of power that they will balance with these new government systems as a way of kind of maintaining some of that tradition and order. So a great example of traditional sources of power is the patriarchy. Again, just remember that's always going to be a continuity in world history. So I hope you know by now, that's always something you can talk about as a social continuity. No matter how much changes, we're still going to have a patriarchy. Religion is going to be a great example of a continuity in Western Europe. The Catholic Church in Western Europe will be the only stable source of power for these Western European people. And for a lot of these feudal lords that are trying to get power, they'll convert to Catholicism to get that ally of the Pope and the Catholic Church. Much in the same way that a lot of sub-Saharan African kings will convert to Islam to get an ally in these expanding caliphates. A lot of kings, like Clovis in France was a great example, will convert to Catholicism, not necessarily out of a conversion of the heart, but because they want that powerful ally in Rome. Landowning elites is going to be that other continuity. Remember, up until the Industrial Revolution, it is a continuity for society and the economy and politics that the people who have all the power are going to be the people who own the land. So your feudal nobles and your lords, the king, anybody who owns land is going to be considered powerful and the elite. And that's basically universal. So some new systems that they're going to have, so the feudal system is going to be a great new example of like a method of taxation. Where people, pay up a certain amount of what they produce. In China, these new Chinese dynasties that they're going to establish, the Sui dynasty, then the Tang and the Song dynasty, they're going to use these expanded tribute systems with not only within China, but with the nomads on their borders. The Tang are going to be really, really good at establishing tributary relationships with the nomads on their borders. They'll also establish tributary relationships with Korea and Japan for a short time. They'll try to exert their influence over Vietnam, but they won't be very successful. Those are just some good examples. You also should know that you're going to have totally new government styles developing in this time. So again, we talked about feudalism in Europe and Japan. You're also going to have those Mongol Khanates being established. So after Genghis Khan dies, his empire will be divided into those Khanates. The Golden Horde up in Russia, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Chagatai Khanate in, sorry, I'm just pulling up the map. The Chagatai Khanate in like Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in what it's going to become Persia, so like that Muslim region of Mongols, and then the Khanate of the Great Khan, which will be most of like Eastern Asia. So that's a new example of a government system. You'll have city-states developing, like I mentioned earlier, the Swahili city-states, the Italian city-states during this time. And so that's going to be really important as well. Let's see. You're also going to have a lot of these new governments that are developing in the post-classical era, picking up traditions as they expand. So as empires or the caliphates or the khanates are going to expand their influence, sometimes they pick up traditions to use as they rule over the people they're conquering. So a great example is that, like, as the Muslim caliphates moved into the territory that had formerly been controlled by Persians, they're going to pick up a lot of the methods of ruling that the Persians used. And one of the great examples is the concept of the vizier. And I use this example because if you've seen the movie Aladdin, you're already comfortable with the concept of vizier. It's the advisors to the king or the sultan. But honestly, in reality, the viziers actually had a lot of power. And often they were the ones really running the show, which I guess is kind of like Aladdin in some ways. But that was a Persian concept that the caliphates are going to pick up. Of course, Japan is going to pick up a lot of Chinese Confucian techniques. They're going to start to structure their imperial court off of the Chinese government during this time. All right. You should understand how the Maya are going to kind of start to die down in this period, but in their wake, they're going to be replaced by the Aztecs. And you should understand, like, the tribute system that the Aztecs used, where basically they would conquer a region, they would conquer a city-state, conquer a kingdom, and they would say, you know, for the most part, you can do your own thing, you can live your own life, you can kind of do what you want, but you must send us tribute every year, kind of like the Hunger Games. So it could either be something you're good at producing, it could be gold or silver or some form of currency, or it could be humans for sacrifice, for our human sacrifice for our religious rituals. So that tribute system in the Aztecs is going to be pretty important. The other important thing you need to know about period 3 is all of the technology that's going to transfer as we get all of these civilizations butting up against each other. So of course, trade is going to be a great example of, like, a cause of technology moving. So, like, for example, you know, as, well, actually, let me back up for a second. So one of the weirder causes that maybe you guys will remember of why people are going to get technology from some other part of the world is going to be war. And a great example is that the Tang Dynasty in China was the first to develop that moving print, that, like, printing type that Johannes Gutenberg will eventually perfect in Europe. But it first was discovered and developed in Tang, China. That technology seeps into the Abbasid Caliphate after the Battle of Talis in, let's see, 751 CE. So that battle is really only important because it will allow that technology. The Arab Abbasid Caliphate will get its hands on this printing technology, and they'll hold on to it. And so a couple hundred years later, when the Christian Crusaders are in the Muslim world because they've gone over to the Middle East to try and reconquer the Holy Land, they will get wind of this new knowledge and they will start to, like, bring it back with them to Western Europe. And that's honestly going to be a factor for a lot of the stuff that Western Europe gets from the Middle East. The Crusades are going to kickstart this new era of trade and technology and knowledge transfer between Western Europe and the Middle East. So of course, the Crusaders aren't going over to the Middle East to try and get new goods or new technology. The Crusades begin, or are launched in the year 1095 CE, as a way to reconquer the Holy Lands from the Seljuk Turks, who were kind of the dominant force in the Middle East at this point. The Crusaders were going over for religious reasons, perhaps some political and economic reasons. A lot of these Crusaders wanted to go over to establish their own little kingdoms, to go from rags to riches. Some of them will even be successful, most of them won't be. But the big effect of the Crusades is that while they're in the Middle East, they will get a taste for the spices of the Middle East. They'll get a taste for the silks and the textiles of the Middle East. They'll even pick up some of the music and things like that from the Middle East. Not just things that are traditionally Arab, but things that were being traded along the trade routes that were linking the Middle East to China and the rest of Southeast Asia and East Africa. And so they're going to bring all this stuff back with them, but they're going to want more. They're not just going to want to eat whatever they brought back and then run out. They're going to want more spices. They're going to want more textiles. They're going to want more food. And so trade is going to really pick up between Western Europe and the Middle East. And the people who are really going to facilitate that are the Italians, because the Italian peninsula is right there. It's easily accessible from Western Europe and from the Middle East. It's kind of like that perfect middleman. And so the merchants from those Italian city-states, places like Venice, Genoa, Milan, they're really gonna make a lot of money off of this trade going back and forth between Western Europe and the Arab states, getting all of these trade goods for those, ex-crusaders and then the generations that come. All of that money in turn will allow them to spend more money on art and architecture and paintings and sculptures and all the lovely things that come with the Renaissance. So the Renaissance is going to be sort of like this indirect effect of the Crusades, which is kind of interesting. And of course, you're also going to have technology traveling all around the Mongolian Empire as Genghis Khan moves people from their homeland to his capital city of Khan Balik. You're going to have people being sent there to work and to build this capital city. But you're also just going to have people trading more because the Mongol Empire makes it so much safer to trade. And as people trade, people share their technology. The one last thing I need to mention, I don't know how I got through this without saying it. Another really important thing that comes from the Middle East that comes back to Western Europe with the Crusaders is a lot of the Greek and Latin writing that the Arab world had held on to. The Western world lost a lot of the writings of the Greeks and the ancient Romans when the Western Roman Empire fell. The Byzantines held on to some of it, but a lot of it was preserved in the Middle East and kept alive by Arab scholars, Arab scientists, Arab mathematicians who took the writings of Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and experimented on their ideas. They developed their science and technology, and a lot of that knowledge is going to come back to Western Europe as well. And eventually, this will kind of help spark these ideas of humanism, this desire to explore the world more scientifically, and in many, many centuries, we'll kind of see that spark fan into the flame of the scientific revolution. All right. Zheng He, you should know him. He travels during this time. He does some cool stuff. He's sponsored actually by the Ming Dynasty. So just to recap with China in this time period, because it's kind of crazy. There's like a million Chinese dynasties. So you have the Han Dynasty collapse, and there is this period of disunity for a long time. About like 300, almost 400 years. It's not going to be until 581, so like right before period 3 starts. It's not going to be until 581 that China is reunified into that Sui dynasty. If you guys remember, the Sui dynasty was legalistic, just like the Qin dynasty. And again, just like the Qin dynasty, it was probably legalistic because they had to pull China back together. They needed to really crack the whip and pull China back together. The other thing that you should know them for was the Grand Canal that they built. That's really mostly why they're important. Oh, Juan, it would have been either written on things like tablets or we had paper at this point, and we had parchment. So they would have written it on like parchment or later on like the paper that the Chinese develop. I'm really sorry that the light is cutting in and out. I've got the brightness all the way up. I don't know why. Maybe my light bulb is going. So the Sui dynasty, super short. They will be followed by the Tang dynasty, which is a dynasty that's loosely descended from a nomadic tribe that existed on the border of China. The Tang dynasty will last for about 300 years, and this is a really golden age in Chinese history. This is a great time for women in China. Still patriarchy, but women are going to have much more freedom in China in the Tang dynasty. than probably any time up until like communist China, honestly, with Mao's 1949 revolution. Women, this is when we'll have our only, actually, you know what? I'm going to move. I'm going to take this with me. So a little bit of walking. Sorry about that. I'm going to move to the dining room table where the lighting is better. Well, all right, here we go. Sorry about that, guys. We will have our only Chinese female empress in China during this time. Let me actually just push. Okay. So the only empress in China who gets to rule in her own right, rather than being like just the wife or the mother of a man, and her name is Empress Wu. And you know, it's kind of indicative of this time period that you know, women have a little bit more respect during this time period. And Nathaniel, I think it is because, you know, we're seeing so much chaos, so much violence. We can't really afford to have these like nice frou-frou sort of governments that protect civil rights. It's actually kind of a universal truth that in times of chaos, in times of political disorder, in times of fear and violence, the governments that tend to rise up and that tend to be successful in controlling people are the governments that are willing to really like crack the whip and force people in their place. Again, like, you know, I don't think any of you are afraid of me at this point. I'm kind of a nice person. I'm like a Confucian government or a Buddhist government. But if you walked into my room and I started handing out community sanctions left and right, and I like had detention for everybody, and like maybe I punched someone in the face for talking out of turn, that would bring any disorder in the classroom to a halt really fast. So if you're not afraid of the government, you're probably not going to like capitulate to it. So that's probably why those legalist dynasties are going to be what bring people back together. Of course, they're also both very short. The Qin dynasty and the Sui dynasty are both only about 30 years long, whereas many of these other dynasties are hundreds and hundreds of years long because people don't like being treated like that. So they overthrow those dynasties pretty quickly. The Tang dynasty is also when we're going to see the height of Buddhism in China. Buddhism's been in China since the Han dynasty, but it's really going to become its most popular in the Tang dynasty. And it's actually going to become so popular that they're actually, the Confucianists and the Taoists even and the legalists are going to go to the Chinese emperor who... sorry, one second, I'm going to see... okay, so Tang Emperor Wuzong, they will go to him and around the year like 845, and they'll say, look, like, you know, these Buddhists are accumulating way too much power, way too much wealth. They're going to try and overthrow you, Wuzong. You need to do something about this. And so Buddhism will be persecuted in China for like several years. He's going to close the shrines, take their property, force the monks and the nuns of Buddhism to go back into like the public life. And so Emperor Wuzong is really going to kind of bring Buddhism in China to a halt. So it's kind of interesting. The Tang dynasty, if you've looked at that timeline I gave you, you see that it says for the Tang dynasty, it has a love-hate relationship with Buddhism. That's because it reaches its height in the Tang dynasty and then is later totally brought down by Buddhism, or I'm sorry, by the Tang dynasty. The Song dynasty is going to come next. This is when we get Neo-Confucianism, which get a big fear of the military. The military is kind of going to be weakened under the Song dynasty, which won't help when the Mongols come a-running. It's also going to be in the Song dynasty that we get champa rice from Vietnam. So the Song dynasty is really going to be responsible for spreading, not only spreading their culture into China, but into like Japan, Vietnam, Korea, but it is really going to take, like, they're going to take on a lot of stuff from those cultures as well. Most notably, the champa rice. Around the year 1000 is probably safe to say when like champa rice is going to show up. So again, that's beginning of the Song dynasty. So the Yuan dynasty is gonna, or the Mongols are gonna come overthrow the Song dynasty, and they're the Yuan dynasty. They're gonna be the Mongols. They're gonna have like second class, like native Chinese people be second class citizens. They're gonna get rid of the civil service exam for a while, but then when they restart it, it'll be just for like people of Mongolian descent. They'll ultimately be brought down by rebellions and be weakened a lot by the Black Death, which occurs, towards the end of their reign in China. And then they are brought down by the Ming Rebellion, which starts the Ming Dynasty in the 1300s. And the Ming Dynasty, again, will continue from 1300s to the 1600s, so well into period 4. But they do start in period 3. And you should know them because of Zheng He, who set sail. Actually, he's going to be one of those first international, sailing expeditionaries. He's going to be the precursor to Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Magellan, all those people. And he has those treasure fleet voyages that he uses to show the world, or at least, the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia region, the Chinese are back. We may have been dominated by the Mongols for about 100 years or so, but we're back. We're better than ever. We're here to trade. We're here to reestablish those tributary relationships. We're good as new. All right. I'm going to hit key concept 3.3 really quickly. So you should know that, so when we talk about agriculture, productivity, and things like this is the time period for things like the Chinampa in the Aztec, the Aztec Empire. And if you don't remember what that is, the Chinampas are the floating gardens that the Aztecs would use that could have these monumental harvests and super rapid harvests because they pulled soil from the bottom of Lake Texcoco, which was super fertile, super rich, and that helped them grow a ton of food really fast. That in turn allowed the Mexica population to boom. And if you remember, the Aztecs are really a triple alliance dominated by the Mexica tribe. And think Mexico, but ending with an A instead of an O. The Mexica people will dominate the Triple Alliance and therefore the area around them because of the Chinampa and the success of the Chinampa system. Another great example is agricultural innovation during this time. The horse collar that they'll use, especially in Western Europe, to harness horses to plows. 3-field rotation will be a method used in a lot of societies, basically moving the plants that you grow around and cycling them over the territory so that you're not seeping all of the nutrients out of the soil. You're going to have a lot of societies doing swamp draining. So the Maya are a great example of that. They'll drain the swamps in Central America and slash and burn a lot of that land so that they can use it. And then you have the waru-waru technique in South America, which will help people, it basically helps you collect rainwater. So you have raised beds where you grow the food, and then you've got dips in between those raised beds so that when it rains, the rainwater will collect in those lowered pools, and you have less runoff and less soil erosion. So that's a really good technique used by the Inca. The Inca will also use terrace farming to farm on the sides of their mountains so that they can farm in the mountains, which will be cool. And the societies that use the most innovative farming techniques, the societies that have the most food, again, they're going to be the successful ones. They're going to be the ones that have huge population growth. They're going to be the ones that see a lot of power during this time. So just, remember that. So you should know that demand for luxury goods is going to increase during this time, especially as trade increases. Oh, and then if you guys remember, one of the last key concepts for this time is that, you know, cities during this time are going to see these periods of rise and periods of fall. And you should know the factors that contribute to the rise and decline of cities. They're pretty easy. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. Factors that contribute to the rise of cities will be warmer temperatures, at least between the years 800 and 1300, greater agricultural productivity with things like chinampas, terrace farming, champa rice. More people will lead to bigger cities. Peacetime means that there's bigger cities. More trade will mean there's bigger cities because people are going to move to the cities to work either in trade or trade-related industries like housing or food or things like that. They'll run an inn or they'll have a little restaurant or something for merchants. So it's not just merchants who will be moving to the cities because of trade. It'll be all sorts of people. And then again, on the other hand, you have disease, war, invasions, a little ice age happening after the year 1300. All of that is going to lead to the decline of cities. So that's pretty easy. All right, so you should know the different kinds of labor that develop in period 3. So we're still going to have slavery. We're always going to have slavery. Even today there's slavery, even though it's illegal in most places. We still very much have slavery all over the world. So slavery is a continuity, basically from the beginning of the Neolithic Revolution onward. Once the work gets too hard, you would rather kidnap most people. I shouldn't even say most people, that's horrible. Many people would rather kidnap other people and force those people to do their work than they would to do that work themselves. You're also going to have free peasant labor. So just peasants work in the land, maybe in the feudal system, but maybe in like in other places where it's not a feudal system, but where they just need people to work the land. Places like China, the Byzantine Empire, will have free peasant labor. Craft production, so we'll have guilds be established in, especially in Western Europe in this time, as a way to kind of protect people who do a trade. Oh, my cat's here. So that they can set prices, set standards for the quality of goods and things like that. Actually, you might remember universities were actually first guilds for scholars, and then they just kind of expanded so that other people could come and learn in those places. You're also going to have nomadic pastoralism. So again, think the Mongols, think the Huns, think the Turks, think the Berbers, people whose way of life doesn't depend on settled farming, but depends on traveling the world with their herds of animals to find food and water and to sell their animals in different places. That's very much an economic alternative to settled farming. You should also know that there's types of coerced labor. So other than slavery, you have government-imposed labor. Think like the Mita system in Inca Empire, where you had, instead of paying taxes, you served your empire doing different types of like community service work, or military obligations. So a lot of societies would say, like, you know, for a certain amount of time, you as a young man would need to serve in the military. The Aztecs are a great example of this. Oh yes, I know you don't like that. All right. Oh my God. Ow, that hurt so bad. Okay, bye. Sorry about that. So of course, you know, when we talk about society, major continuities are patriarchy, social castes, like think India. Even though India during this time is going to go through a lot of political changes, they're going to see the rise of like the Mughal Empire, the Delhi Sultanate, things like that. The Hindu caste system will be a continuity in India all the time. Patriarchy will be a continuity all the time. Land-based nobility and land-based elites are going to be a continuity all the time, but we are going to see some fluctuations in that. So a great example is that, like, in some places, women are going to have some power and influence, or at least some more power and influence than in other places. So again, we talked about the Tang Dynasty versus the Song Dynasty. Mongolian women are going to have a ton of freedom. I'm sure you guys probably remember about that. West African and like sub-Saharan African women are going to have a ton of freedom. If you remember Ibn Battuta's writings, when he went into sub-Saharan Africa, he was just appalled that women were allowed out of their homes. They were able to like walk around often topless, talking to men who weren't their husbands or fathers or brothers. Women in Japan and many places in Southeast Asia are going to have some freedom. If you guys remember the Trung sisters, who led a rebellion against Vietnam. I'm sorry, they were Vietnamese sisters, but they led a rebellion against China. Technically, this was not in period 3. The Trung sister rebellion was in period 2, but that's a good demonstration of this culture in Vietnam that reveres women, that gave women equal rights to men. And that's a big part of the reason why Chinese culture never really took off in Vietnam. Vietnam is much closer to the Indian Ocean trade routes and Southeast Asia. It's not like Korea and Japan, which are both kind of cut off from the rest of the world by China. China could really exert a lot of influence over Japan and Korea because Japan and Korea don't really have anyone else close to them. Vietnam has access to a lot of other cultures. And so even though China tries to exert its influence, tries to take over Vietnam, tries to enforce its patriarchal views, the Vietnamese just aren't having it. And because they can go other places for trade and alliances, they never really have to capitulate to Chinese Confucian values the way Korea and Japan do. But even before, China gets its teeth into Japan, Japanese women are also going to have a lot of freedom. If you guys remember, the first book ever written is written by a Japanese woman. It's the Tales of Genji, and it is written by Murasaki Shikibu in the year, well, we actually don't know exactly the year, but like the early 11th century, so like the 1000s. So well in this time. But Japanese women were allowed to do calligraphy. They were allowed to have a voice in the court. They were allowed to write and things like that. All right. So we talked about, we talked about that, but we also should remember there's going to be some continuities in terms of like women having rights from period 2. So like we're still going to have monasteries. Women are still going to be able to join monasteries or convents, become nuns with Christianity and Buddhism. Also remember, as Islam spreads, I said this in the last video, but Islam is going to start out as a pretty gender equalizing religion. It'll quickly abandon that in many areas of the world, but like at first, Islam is going to do a lot for women's rights. And one of the rights that it'll offer women, at least in some places, will be the right to divorce an abusive husband, which is really important because most societies at this point in history don't allow that. Of course, then when we get to the Song Dynasty, we're going to get to foot binding, which is, horrible, but it is, I guess you win some and you lose some. All right. So let's see. I think that's it. Do you guys have any questions? I kept that under about an hour. Of course, I didn't go into a lot of detail about the Mongols. I didn't go into a lot of detail about like Inca and Aztec society. I hope you guys remember those because I think the Inca and the Aztec societies were kind of interesting. So I think you guys knew the Mongols pretty well. But if you have any questions about those civilizations, definitely let me know. I didn't go too much into India. Again, you got the Delhi Sultanate when Islam expands into India, and this is when we're going to start to see Islam and Muslim rulers ruling over a majority Hindu population. And so a lot of these rulers are going to have to be very benevolent and very open-minded about religion so that they don't anger all of their, Hindu subjects. And then the Delhi Sultanate will later be replaced by the Mughal dynasty, which we'll talk about when we talk about the gunpowder empires in period 4. All right, I'm not seeing any questions. 6 of you guys are watching, so that's kind of cool. Hopefully this was helpful. That was period 3. And yeah, that was a tough period. If you guys remember, that took us like 8 weeks, 9 weeks to cover. So I'm going to pause this video now, and I'm going to go. So good luck, guys. For those of you who are going to play Kahoot tonight, I'm going to try and play along as well. So we'll see how it goes.